Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is rather chilly morning. It's so nice to see you at early hour. Well, again, we have a very special guest speaker who will enlighten us on Pacific, particularly the Pacific, the Asia-Pacific integration. Professor Peter Petri is currently the Carl J. Shapiro Professor of International Finance at the Brandeis International Business School and a senior fellow of the East-West Center in Hawaii. By the way, the East-West Center was established by the U.S. Congress. He served as Dean of International Business School at Brandeis from its founding in 1994 until 2006. In fact, he was the professor who made this school very, very distinguished in academia. Professor Petri's research focuses on international trade, finance, and investment with primary application to the Pacific Rim. In fact, he is the leading scholar in this research field. Through numerous books and articles he wrote, he contributed so much in the research in this particular area. With his this kind of background, he's been consulting, of course, U.S. government and the various multilateral institutions. And of course, he's been the friends with Korea for many years. He comes to Korea quite often, and he writes various his enlightening views on the Korea and Korea's particularly trade and investment front. With no further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Petri to share his enlightening views with us. Please join me.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Dr. Sakong, as you know, is one of the really preeminent people in the world, I think, in supporting international cooperation and advancing the cause of international cooperation. So it's a real special pleasure to be here. And Korea is itself, I think, emerging as perhaps the country most committed to international trade and international cooperation and to advancing the role of economic integration as an engine of world growth. It has served Korea awfully well in the 25 years or so that I have studied Korea. I think the achievements are unparalleled. And they're unparalleled even today when one looks at what China has accomplished, which of course is extraordinary too. But the Chinese are very much looking at Korea as the model that has overcome this middle-income trap that I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's a term now quite widely used in the development literature. And Korea is one of the very, very few countries that has managed to kind of zoom past that middle-income level with economic growth rates and continued economic progress. So it's an issue that is obviously very close to the minds of Chinese policymakers as policymakers all around the world. Now, so that is as background. I think this is the right place for me to talk about the issues that I would like to talk about today, which is the continued progress of trade integration in the world. As you know, the story is not very good. The World Trade Organization negotiations have basically stalled. And I think if one looks at the problem that they are trying to solve, which is to address world trade in all of its complexity by 180 countries on a consensus-based system. In other words, they have to reach agreement on everything by 180 countries on a consensus-based system. It's easy to understand why it is not likely to work. So against that background, we have now a very rapid growth of trade agreements, both in the Asia-Pacific and now also the initiative by the United States and 10 other partners to build what was once a very small free trade agreement, an agreement among Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and Brunei, so-called P4 trade agreement, to build that into the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, you may not all be familiar with it, has 11 countries currently involved, in addition to the original 4, the United States, Australia, Peru, Mexico, Canada. I'm not sure I have the whole list right, but Chile have now all become part of the 11 negotiating countries. Japan has indicated its interest of joining, but as a result of the political complications in Japan, and of some of the changes they would have to make in agriculture, in services, opening up the Japanese economy, there is a great deal of political debate there, and it's not clear whether they will resolve that in favor of opening negotiations with the TPP. So 11 countries are there. They have had so far 14 rounds of negotiations. Now, to give you a sense of what one of these rounds is like, it typically involves something like 500 to 600 negotiators from the 11 economies. They spend typically close to a week together. They have very intensive rounds of discussions with outsiders, business people, non-government organizations, to advise them on their views. So it's a very complicated business. They've been at this now for well over a year. They've had 14 of these rounds. Much work is still to go. And as I will explain, a lot of the work really won't be done, cannot be finished until after the U.S. presidential elections, when we know who the next president is. And the next president will have to make some very tough decisions on how far to represent U.S. business interests and how far to kind of grasp this opportunity to build a truly the beginnings of a truly region-wide system. So that will be part of my story. And the bottom line is essentially this. The bottom line is that negotiation, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, and a whole set of other negotiations which are going on in Asia, and I will talk some about that too. The research that I have been conducting has covered both the TPP and also trade negotiations that are underway in Asia. That these together are a big positive sum game. They could yield a prize ultimately if what comes out at the end is a region-wide free trade area, an area that encompasses the Asian side of the Pacific as well as the American side, the Americas, the United States, as well reaching down into South America. If all of that can be combined into a single free trade area, which is to some extent the ultimate objective of the TPP, the results could be as high as $2 trillion of additional benefits per year, additional income gains per year. How to get there? Part of what I will talk about is that the way to get there is itself, in a way, a part of the process of developing these free trade areas. That if you start and are successful with building a Trans-Pacific track, chances are you will stimulate some progress on Asian negotiations. You will stimulate some progress on negotiations between China and Korea first, but possibly between China, Japan, and Korea next, and eventually along the way among all of the countries of all of the ASEAN plus 6 countries, the Southeast Asian countries, Northeast Asia, plus India. So a successful TPP track will generate some progress on the Asian track, and a success on the Asian track will generate also progress on the TPP track, because the United States and the Latin American economies, seeing progress in Asia, will themselves want to respond with building stronger presence in the region. So I think the possibilities here, and I will focus on the word possibilities. Nothing about this is assured. Nothing about this is certain. But the possibilities are a progress in Asian track, progress on the TPP track, and competitive liberalization that advances both tracks. Now, the last conclusion that I want to make is, as you know, it's hard to think of a time when the world needed such an effort more than today. The world economy is in trouble. It's probably facing its most serious crisis in 70 years. I'm optimistic about how it's all going to end, but it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be very painful. We know that already. And in that context, the idea that we can once again begin to build a world trading system that works, that generates more opportunities for business in Korea, business in China, business in the United States, building a world trading system that works will provide a very large dose of confidence, which we badly lack today. So even though these agreements take a long time to put into effect, they take at least 3 to 5 years to negotiate. They take another 5 to 10 years to implement. Even though the real effects of these agreements may be very slow to take effect, the confidence that reaching them or achieving such agreements can generate can be very quick. So that's really the short of my long story, and I will try to put some background to that. The TPP, I will begin with the TPP, is a very big deal. It's a big deal because, as I've already argued, the world trading system needs something new, needs a new spurt of innovation. And if that innovation is to come, it will come almost certainly from the Asia Pacific. Here we have the world's most dynamic economies. We have about 2/3 of world trade. The Asia Pacific countries, and now I'm counting both the Asian and the Americas side, account for 2/3 of exports or imports, or in some cases both, of world trade. About $1.6 trillion of that trade crosses the ocean. And what we need is a system which addresses the many barriers that still impede this trade across the ocean, and help to support cooperation in a wide range of areas for small and medium enterprises to become more active in trade flows and on development in general. And let me say one other thing, which you will see as the discussion proceeds, is that some initiatives, and particularly the TPP initiative, are attempting to both open markets for the industries that advanced economies, that are strong in advanced economies, like the United States, by which I mean industries like services, investment, industries that create technology, that therefore require intellectual property protection. So it's trying to create opportunities for those industries, as well as and large opportunities for more standard manufactured exports. So it's trying, in a sense, to create a trading system which covers the whole world as it now functions in the 21st century, with a lot of technology trade, a lot of intellectual products trade. I have recently begun to watch, as I'm sure many of you have, Gangnam Style, and Korea is now a very important intellectual products exporter. How that happened, nobody really knows, but we do know that it is a very important intellectual products exporter. Music, movies, software in many cases. So it is very much in the middle of this 21st century economy. And for that economy to function, you need very open markets for goods trade, for electronics, for chemicals, for pharmaceuticals, for automobiles, and very open markets also for intellectual property trade. And if all of that works, then the benefits can be enormous. This is a graph that I've already alluded to, and you probably know already. It's a graph of what has happened to trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific. The red line is the bilateral trade agreements, primarily involving Asian economies. For example, the Korea-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement between Korea and the Southeast Asian economies will be one of the red tall bars. But the most important, most rapidly growing section over the last few years have been Asia-Pacific, Trans-Pacific bilateral agreements. There is, for example, an agreement between China and Chile, and a number of agreements now that are beginning to try to open up that market. What there has not been is very much activity on the part of the United States. We do have a free trade agreement with Australia, with Singapore, but those are easy. We don't have the really hard ones with China and Japan. And of course, we have the Korean agreement, which is probably the single most important agreement that the United States has signed since 1993, in nearly 20 years since it concluded the Uruguay round. Now, there is a big difference, though, if you look carefully, between agreements that cover Asian countries only and those that cover the Trans-Pacific links. That difference you can see in terms of tariffs. Generally, the Asian agreements leave out more products, liberalize more slowly, so that in the end you have higher and more varied tariffs remaining. The Trans-Pacific agreements, if they are done along historical patterns, and that's the blue line, tend to cover more tariffs more quickly and open up markets more rapidly. You also see this difference in terms of a lot of different special categories which are involved in trade agreements. I won't try to list these, and it's impossible for you to see them. They are available on a website, so that I would be happy to share these with you. But essentially, what they show is that The Trans-Pacific agreements, the ones that involve the United States, involve Canada, involve some of Chile as well, for example, very demanding partner, tend to have good rules on government procurement, tend to have good rules on rules of origin, on agriculture. In other words, they tend to cover the whole range of trading opportunities with relatively high quality rules. That does not appear to be true for trade agreements among Asian countries, which nevertheless open up a great deal of new markets, but they do not do it as aggressively and as completely as the Trans-Pacific agreements do. So these are the pieces. These, by the way, are based on a full analysis of Asian as well as Trans-Pacific agreements. We use data from APEC and from the WTO, but these are the pieces that then lead to very different results in modeling what might be the benefits of these two tracks. There are a very large range of issues, particularly on the TPP, that remain to be decided, and this is what I've alluded to earlier. If you look, for example, on intellectual property, there are three sets of issues, very tough to negotiate. One set has to do with copyright infringement, people copying music or movies online. Another set of issues has to do with how long patents are, how long copyright protection lasts. Another set of issues has to do with what kinds of medicines can be claimed for insurance purposes with government-based insurance systems. So all of these are, as you might expect, the result of companies with lots of intellectual property right protection in advanced countries like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, efforts to protect that intellectual property. Those are not fully resolved because there are economies like Vietnam, like Malaysia, and others that benefit from copying and sometimes selling those products at a cheaper price. There is the issue of state-owned enterprises. One set of rules that this new set of agreements would establish are rules to limit the extent to which governments can provide support to state-owned enterprises through government banks, government procurement, and other channels. How many service sectors will be opened? Whether there will be investor-state dispute resolution, whether a company can take a government to an impartial jury, typically operated by the World Bank or the United Nations, in order to resolve disputes. Now, the interesting thing about this list is that Korea has, for the most part, already adopted many of these provisions at a very high level in the Korea-U.S. agreement. So for Korea to enter this treaty would be, in fact, not a very hard new decision, because it would be simply widening the applicability of things that it has already agreed to in the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement. So, but for other countries, it is a big deal. So the question really is whether the kinds of rules that have been now established in Korea-U.S. trade, how broadly they will apply in the future. Many of these issues, as I said, in the TPP agreement will not be decided until after the United States has a president, and the president can make a decision on what extent this treaty is important enough to make compromises on U.S. positions. I will now give you a set of numbers, a few numbers based on a study that three of us have conducted. I did this with Professor Michael Plummer at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Fan Zhai, who is now at the China Investment Corporation. He is a very strong modeler, and we have been working together on many issues for several years. What you will see are results from a fairly complicated economic model. I won't go into the details of it. The details, by the way, are presented. We have a website. It's called www.asiapacifictrade.org, which presents both the results and some of the data, so a lot more information available. Let me just highlight a few of the ways in which the model works, and then get to the results themselves. The model works by having high productivity firms grow when trade opportunities become available. This is something many of you are familiar with from your own business, that when trade options open up, the most productive firms become stronger and are very able to take advantage of them. Now, when you generalize this to the economy-wide level, it generates very positive results, because it means that resources are essentially transferred to some of the strongest industries in every country, and as a result, productivity for the world as a whole rises. At the same time, we go to some extent, to considerable extent, to be very conservative about the kind of liberalization we feed into the model. So we make sure that all existing agreements are taken into account, and the benefits are ascribed only to the new kinds of new improvements in the trade prospects of companies. In countries, we remove barriers only partially, understanding that there will be some compromises made. In other words, we try to be very realistic about the nature of the assumptions fed in. And then come the scenario. Oops, sorry. Then come the scenarios. As you can see, we are fairly aggressive about what we assume. And I think as the conversations go on, and as these agreements become more likely in the future, it's probably likely that we're over-optimistic on some of the assumptions. That won't change the nature of the results, that is, the size of the benefits that we predict. It may change the timing of them and when we see them. On the Trans-Pacific track, we assumed here, and this was about a year ago when the last calculations were made, we're ready for a new set of calculations, but we assumed that first the 9 countries negotiating last year would conclude an agreement. Then we would add Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Korea a year later. And the question, which I think I would partly put to you, is how realistic that is. Canada and Mexico have now joined, so that part of it is now, in fact, in place. Japan and Korea, not so likely, I think, in the near future, for reasons that I think we can discuss also later. But probably eventually, yes. This is, if this agreement does become effective, if it does become broader and grow, that it's very likely that both Japan and Korea will join. In the meantime, the Asian track, we began it with China, Japan, Korea agreement in the beginning. Not as likely as I think we would have said a year ago, for reasons that I think very obvious today, that the political contests are tougher. There are more political disagreements than we would have expected a year ago. But at the same time, a China-Korea agreement seems reasonably likely in the near future. And then RCEP, which is the regional cooperation scheme that includes all of the Asian countries, ASEAN +6, that may begin negotiations as soon as November. So we may, in fact, begin to see some of the basis for this, which would lead to an agreement in 2016. ASEAN representatives say it would lead to an agreement in 2015. That may be a reasonable guess at this point. But then we assume something very positive at the end. And that is, I think, ultimately the challenge that faces the United States, the region, and Korea, is to try to knit this into a region-wide free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, to knit this into a single large regional trading bloc that would reach all the way across the Pacific. I don't know whether that will happen. I will show you some results on what the consequences of that happening are, and they're very positive. And the hope is that because we begin to understand just how positive those results might be, that the path toward achieving it might become more feasible. Let me move now to a picture of Korean benefits under the various scenarios. And I won't try to talk in detail about each of the lines, but the basic point that I want to show you is that the red line, which are Asian agreements, is typically higher for Korea in the beginning than the black line, which are Trans-Pacific agreements. Now, why is that? And I think intuitively we all know the answer to that, because Korea already has an FTA with the United States, with some of the other partners in the TPP grouping. And so its major benefits are no longer from joining that grouping, but rather from joining the Asian path, and in particular to creating a free trade agreement with China. And that's what you see from here very clearly, that the Asian agreements for the intermediate future offer much higher benefits to Korea than the Trans-Pacific track. We understand that, I think, in the United States. But the graph also shows something else, which is that as the tracks extend, eventually the black line crosses the red line, meaning as more countries join both tracks, which is likely, it is also likely that these higher quality standards that are built into the Trans-Pacific Agreement will generate greater benefits to Korea and to all other partners than the Asian track would by itself. Asian track offers the Chinese market, offers a path to Asia-Pacific markets more generally, but it offers them at much lower standards, and therefore much less trade, much more impediments to doing business abroad, and lower benefits. So that's the basic message that comes out of this story. To Korea, the short-term benefits are not that great. The long-term benefits of trying to build a system based on the high standards that are built into the Asia-Pacific template as advocated in the TPP are in fact of great interest. For the United States, the same lines show much higher benefits in general from the TPP track than from the Asian track. That's understandable because it's part of the TPP track, not part of the Asian track. And then for China, you see a graph somewhat similar but more extreme than the case for Korea. You see it actually declining at first. China might, if left out of the black line of the Trans-Pacific agreements, it would actually suffer some losses. But then if it joins, and as the agreements become broader, its gains would again exceed those of agreements on the Asian track alone, because the higher standards would permit it to enjoy more trade. So, basic story. United States has a lot at stake. We want to be in the region. We want to encourage our relationships with economies in the region. The Trans-Pacific track is the immediate way to that. For a country like Korea, which already has strong relations with the United States, the Asian track is the immediate priority because it opens up Asian markets. And for all countries, including Korea and China and the United States, ultimately this high standard integrated regional system is where the benefits lie. Those benefits, as I've argued, are very large. I haven't focused on the numbers in these charts, but they amount to about $2 trillion. Where those benefits come from, if one looks closer into the model, you can tell the details. For Korea, they come from market access to exports, imports of manufactured goods at relatively low prices, and a lot of it with FDI. For China, it would also be market access for exports. But for China, actually, the continued and increased flow of FDI into China would be especially important. And for the U.S., the benefits would not involve goods trade for the most part, but outward FDI, the ability to invest well abroad, and to market our services abroad would be very important sources of gains. Let me conclude with two quick slides. One, an optimistic scenario on where all of this might head. And two, the second of the slides will be on the policy implications for the United States, but also for its partners in Asia. On the optimistic scenario of where this might lead, for the time being, initially, it's likely to be competitive. It's likely to mean that the Asian and the TPP tracks both try to compete for members, both try to compete for better terms, and this may generate some tension between the United States and China in the process. As I will argue in the next slide, I hope we can minimize those tensions. I hope that at the same time we can build stronger relationships directly with China to minimize those tensions. But I think some of that can be expected. So when you hear that this is an effort to contain China, I don't think that's true. But it is a kind of natural example of the competition between a China-based, Asian-centered set of trade agreements and this wider Trans-Pacific set of agreements which the United States is advocating. So I think some of this tension is inevitable and is likely to be there in the beginning. Now, in the middle stages, as these agreements progress, as Japan, Korea, and some of the middle-sized economies join one or probably both tracks, there is no particular reason why you should not be able to be a member of both RCEP, the Asian integration process, and the Trans-Pacific process with different standards. RCEP, relatively low standards, the Trans-Pacific process, relatively high standards, a very demanding template. As that begins to develop, both tracks are going to show gains. Both tracks are going to become important to business. Business will be using both tracks to conduct its transactions. And the leadership for these tracks will become wider. The leadership now on the Asian track is really China for the most part. The leadership on the TPP track, although the United States did not begin the TPP track, it was there, it joined later, but it is, for all practical purposes, right now, the United States. So that leadership, which now is the two big economies, will become wider, because with middle-sized economies like Korea and Japan in both groups, it will be a more open and a more widely shared grouping. And then finally, and this is really the most speculative part. You will, if this system proceeds as it is now seems to be headed, China will have built around itself an ASEAN bloc, with Northeast Asian economies, certainly Korea, maybe Japan included. The United States will have built around itself a Trans-Pacific bloc, with most Southeast Asian economies, perhaps Japan and Korea also included. The two large countries, China and Japan, will have opened up their markets to virtually everybody else, but not to each other. At that point, it's almost certain that they will look to each other and say, how did we do this? How did we manage to give away so much benefits to everybody else, but not provide preferential market access to each other. And I think it's at that point that a consolidation of the two tracks in some form, and it's very hard to tell in what form, is likely. I might add that at that point it's possible that Europe will say that this is a very good deal. We already have lots of agreements in Asia. Let us too get into the game, and that we move back toward a global, or at least a three-sided Europe, United States, Asian track. So I think the ultimate results of this early competition are probably quite positive. But I cannot see how we might get there without first passing through this phase of competition between a nation-centered and a trans-Pacific bloc. That leads me just to the final slide, which are my policy conclusions. First of all, I very much hope that this will happen, at least with respect to the TPP, next year. Now, why next year? Next year will be one of those very few years, not many in the political calendar, where the American president can make decisions for the long run without worrying too much about his own reelection or even a reelection of his party. So next year is a very crucial time. It's a political window. President Obama has said that he is America's first Pacific president. He wants to make sure that America's presence in the Pacific is widely felt. I think Governor Romney, should he be elected, and obviously right now it's very difficult to tell who will be. Governor Romney has been a bit more critical of trade between the United States and China and the Asia Pacific, but I think fundamentally there is much less difference there in the actual governing than it sounds like there is right now in the campaigning. So my guess is that either president will be very favorably disposed toward this agreement, and 2013 will be the time to do it. It's unlikely that Japan will come in at this point because of its political I would very much like to see Japan come in, but it's unlikely because of its political debates. Korea, I would even more love to see Korea come in next year as an important architect of this project. But I don't quite think that the timing is right, partly because its negotiations with China are ongoing, and partly because it will want to see how this project proceeds. Ultimately, I would imagine that Korea has both very high stakes in building a region-wide system based on high quality rules. Both very high stakes in that, and also just a commitment to making this regional system work as the key trading power in the region. So I would hope that eventually Korea will come in too. But whether that happens next year, I don't know. And if it doesn't, then certainly 2013 will be the time to bring this to a close, in part to avoid the kind of indefinite process that the Doha round seemed to be going through. To do that, I think the United States will have to make concessions. And I think that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing for the United States to be in a position where it shows the region that it values its relationship with this region highly enough to be willing to make some concessions to include countries like Vietnam at a much lower level of economic development in a direct partnership. And so I think that's good. And it also then bodes well if we make some concessions for ultimately including China and other regional economies in the system. Now, two particular things that I think will need to happen over the course of the next year and more generally over the next few years. We need to somehow bridge these two tracks to make sure that while competitive, they not stray too far away from each other. They do not become opponents in a sense. They become competitive ways of opening up markets for everyone. I think that is where Korea could play an enormous role. It is involved in both tracks. It has negotiated with the United States. It is negotiating with China. It knows the region very well, and its future rests on trade. So I think this is a place where Korea could play a very important role, maybe together with other regional partners, like New Zealand, for one, is very keen. Singapore is another, which is very keen to create a region-wide, high-quality trading system. Finally, and that's the last point, is that the United States and China need, once our election is over, once their change in governments is over, once we can both look forward again to next 4 years, next 2 decades of progress, that we will need to be very cognizant that somehow the regional system needs to be knit together, and it will ultimately depend on these two very large countries to what extent that succeeds. So that will require special cooperation. There's a very long list of projects that the two countries could pursue without involving anybody else, just conflicts with each other. From solar panels to, you know the list, from on up to giving China most favored nation treatment in a number of areas where until 2016 it would not have it. For example, we don't the anti-duty dumping cases get a very strange treatment with respect to China until 2016, until it has market economy status. So there is a long list of things we can do together. I think we should start on that now in order to give the rest of the world confidence that these two very large economies can work together and can build the foundations of a stronger regional trading system together, even if it does not involve an immediate free trade area. So I will stop there and would be delighted to hear your views and comments on these issues.
Yes, why don't you take a seat? Okay, thank you very much. Very, very, very comprehensive and illuminating presentation on Asia-Pacific trade. To most Koreans, ordinary Koreans, I think TPP is not really very familiar, and the topic for common conversation, but it does have a very, very important implication for Korea's trade in the future, and since we are in the process of the negotiating with the actually Japan is stalled, and China's negotiation will soon begin. But TPP is much more wider, covers wider areas, and so it has. One can imagine substantial the impacts it can have on Korean economy. But Professor Petri, they showed us specifically how it would affect the Korean income and the Korean economy. Okay, with this, if you have any thoughts on the presentation or other comments or questions to be made regarding, yes, Dr. Kim, please.
Thank you, Professor Petri, for your presentations. It's very illuminating. TPP is very unique among all the FTA agreements these days in that it started out, as you recall, by original 4 countries really living up to the true spirit of WTO's original concept of true economic union, which of course these days all the FTAs are in violation. However, as it has been expanding, obviously that concept cannot be kept. Now, it's a shame that we are deviating from the original concept of WTO's most favored nation clause, which really does not allow customs union type of agreements, but the complete economic unions, except one provision for the substantial world trade within the reasonable period of time. Those are the loose terms stretched like chewing gums everywhere they want to apply. Now, you go to the Asia track, we have particular problem. There is a Japan, which is really developed economy, but behaving very underdeveloped in terms of international economic agreements. And China, whose system as well as its economy is very not conducive to those kind of full agreements with the developed economy. Now, in TPP's concept, as you expand the area, how far philosophically are you prepared to bend that original philosophy for the benefit of widening the area? It's a question I would like to answer your question.
Okay. Why don't you invite a couple more questions or comments? Anyway, yes, Professor Wang, please.
Thank you for your excellent lecture. I'd like to make one comment on your two tracks, TPP tracks and the Asian track. I feel that there's some problem with the Asian track. Korea, Japan, China are very competitive economies, especially it's based on manufacturing sector. So I feel that it's very difficult to make the Korea-China FTAs because the agricultural problem and the employment problem. If Korea have the FTA with China, full-scale FTA, then there will be great unemployment problem here. And there will be same with Japan. I think that it will be much easier for Korea and Japan to join TPP first, than joining FTA with China. So Korea and Japan, USA, and Korea already has FTA with Japan, the USA, and some South American countries. So we need the FTA with this among China, Japan, Korea, but I think that will be very difficult because of this manufacturing the based economies. So I think they should think about that kind of program here for the Asian track. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Would you like to respond to this? Yes.
Yes. I think to Dr. Kim's points first, it is definitely true that the TPP tries to the extent possible to live up to this very demanding WTO standard of removing substantially all barriers to the regional trading system. It tries to do that obviously by comprehensive coverage, by going in many cases behind the border to try to control the regulatory environment in which trade impediments are nowadays increasingly found. So the TPP tries to do that, and it tries to do that by encompassing many previously existing agreements. And in that, in itself, is creating a kind of new model for how to take a whole set of existing trade agreements and how to integrate them. And as best as I understand it, the negotiators are not likely to get there completely. That is, they are not likely to erase all of the previous agreements completely and replace them with a single agreement that applies to all 11 economies. But they will make some important steps. One of the steps that might be of particular interest to business is that they are likely to come up with a single rule of origin for the region, meaning that what you need to determine that you are eligible for preferences within regional trade is the same regardless of which economy you are or where you're trading, and that you can count as inputs into your production process things made anywhere in the region among the 11 countries. So this will generate for the first time an integrated rules of origin, which don't now exist in Asia or elsewhere. So it will do a lot of things to stick close to the WTO principles and to begin consolidating this thing that has been called the noodle bowl of East Asian trade agreements. Now, the larger issue of whether compromises will have to be made, my guess is yes, because economies like Vietnam already at this stage will require some compromises. If nothing else, at least very long implementation periods. So it will take a long time for Vietnam to follow all the rules that you build into the TPP process. And then eventually, if China is included, then or if a new agreement is developed with China as part of it, it will need a new set of qualifications, a new set of compromises. So, but it's philosophically, I suppose the point is that one wants to make sure that the depth of liberalization more than offsets the violations that we make to the original multilateral trading system, and that if you can include a huge economy like China and get it to reduce the impediments or the interventions that it undertakes in trade to a large extent, even if you don't succeed as fully as you'd like, you will have made a big contribution. So my sense is that's far off. We don't know, and China in the meantime may reform very rapidly, and we may find ourselves in a position that the compromises don't have to be ultimately as great as they would have to be now. But I think this is a project in which we are now trying to rebuild the trading system from the bottom up, and it will take many steps. Professor Wong's point, I'm delighted to hear that you think that the TPP might be a higher priority or an earlier priority than negotiations on the Asian track. I don't know if that will, in terms of market access, the real challenge Korea faces is market access to the Chinese market at this point. And to the extent that you can make a dent in that, as a negotiator, I would probably want to go there first. But ultimately, I think Korea's, given its strong commitment to trade, given its flexibility and its ability to move into new industries, ultimately it's that line that crosses the TPP template line that crosses the template of the Asian more modest agreements. That is where the benefits lie. So I would agree with you that eventually I think it's very much in Korea's interest to participate in building that system.
Yeah, to pursue on the Dr. Wang, Dr. Wang's the question. I'm very much interested in getting your observations and your views on some the Koreans' concern about Korea-China FTA. Putting agricultural issue and service issue aside, their concern is already Korea's trade dependency is with on China is so high, almost 25%, and the U.S. only around 10 to 11%, and Japan about same too. So even putting Japan, U.S. together is still not as big as the proportion of China. So their concern is our too high dependency on China may become a strategic problem. So that's one question. So I'm very interested in getting your observations or your views on this type of concern. Second, with Japan, most Korean businesses are concerned about the not just tariff but non-tariff barriers. Japanese tariff rate is already substantially low compared to ours, and only about half. So many manufacturers are concerned about this non-tariff barriers rather than the tariff itself. So I'm very interested in your view and your observation on these points.
On China, I think it is very much in China's interest now to develop an agreement with Korea. And it's no secret to you, and probably the difficulties that China has been having with Japan over the territorial issues have emphasized that interest. So my guess is that the implication of that is that China will be willing to make concessions on a number of areas that will be in Korea's interest. Now, Korea does have, in addition to the import-dependent side, also concerns on the export side, and particularly the high-technology products are facing, I would guess, it's very hard to tell, but I would guess some competition from Chinese manufacturers that is not entirely based on market. Some of them will be in the west of China, so some of them will just move inside China, but others will move to Southeast Asia, and particularly Vietnam, maybe Myanmar eventually. And so the TPP does offer a possibility for countries to use those production bases as an alternative to access American and European markets. So I think that's certainly something to consider. And I agree that these are issues that you will have to pursue with the Chinese. With respect to Japan, the U.S. has long had concern about Japanese NTBs, as you know, non-trade barriers. And in particular, there is quite strong opposition to Japan's entry into the TPP by the American automobile industry, which believes that nothing it can do somehow is going to be able to open up Japanese auto markets to American manufacturers. And there, too, I think other kinds of compromises will be necessary if Japan is to enter the TPP, primarily in services, primarily in inward investment and in opening up markets for inward investment. So in areas other than some of these manufacturing NTBs. I think the problem with those NTBs is I started doing research on them 25 years ago, and they're just too deeply built into somehow the Japanese manufacturing system to permit easy solutions, to permit government-based solutions. So one hopes that other areas of the economy, Japanese economy, provide benefits that offset that.
So it is a genuine concern.
It's a real concern.
Everybody. Yes. Okay. Yes, Mr. Hong, please.
You would know nowadays, especially between China and the U.S., as you are indicating, for further cooperation on the longer run. You must have heard about Huawei and this scandal, especially U.S. side congressional decision making to avoid some kind of securities reasonings and these things. Don't you think that this kind of, scandal on these things will hinder on the longer run for having a complete TPP, especially between U.S. and China? You indicated there the third tracks on the rather longer run, but these subjects must be so sensitive, then I think that will bring some kind of impact. How do you evaluate and foresee of this kind of matters? It will take quite a long time in that sense. So.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Kim.
Yes. Thank you. I think for the successful completion of TPP, the support of the political parties is very important. In this sense, I'd like to ask you, what's the attitudes of the two parties, Republican Party and the Democratic Party? In general, the overall position of the two parties. That's my first question. And my second question is, as you mentioned, that U.S. auto industry is very strongly object to the inclusion of Japan. In this sense, I'd like to ask you, would you please a little bit more detail in mentioning the industry-specific issues? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just one more. Yes, please. One more question or comment.
Thank you. On the Asian track that you've mentioned, there are two competing agreements at the moment. One is the
Could you tell us who you are first, please?
Sorry, Mike White from the Australian Embassy. Thank you very much for your excellent lecture.
Mm-hmm.
So on the Asian side, there are two competing free trade agreements moving forward. One of them is the trilateral between China, Japan, and Korea, and the other one is RCEP. How do you see this fitting into your kind of Trans-Pacific or Asian track analogy? And of those two agreements, which one do you think is likely to be the more ambitious? The one with more people or the one that includes China?
A lot of very interesting questions. The Huawei this report, which was just issued by the U.S. Congressional Research Service, is very troubling, and I haven't really internalized it. I think it's very clear that in a way this is the true deep issue that somehow the Chinese-U.S. relationship has to overcome, is the strategic distrust which was identified by Ken Lieberthal and Wang Jixi in an essay recently, that these countries don't right now trust each other over many key strategic issues. And as a result, many economic relationships between the two that might otherwise be just normal economic relationships are coming under suspicion, and particularly the high technology companies that China is eager to develop at this point are of great concern. I don't know what the solution to is. I mean, there's some of the suggestions that have been made is that there are technological ways of certifying products from these companies that might address these issues. On the other hand, others say that they are just too pervasive and it will be too difficult to limit. But I would guess that what you first need to address are the basic strategic distrust issues to somehow get past those. And maybe the technology companies are not the right place to start. I mean, a better place to start might be a whole range of other export industries where there is much more common interest. So I'm still hopeful that we can begin to rebuild that trust, and that eventually in that process some of the high technology company trade can be better controlled as well. On the politics, I think the politics are less complicated than they may look. That both Republicans and Democrats understand that the place for the United States is very much to be engaged in Asia, and that a trade agreement that includes Asian economies, particularly as long as it doesn't include China, which it doesn't for now, is likely to be very much of interest to both. Now, the people behind I think this is one of the interesting pieces of it. The people behind these agreements will have different motivations. Some, like me, will say this is good economics. Let's move forward with agreements that improve the economics of cooperation in the region. Some will say, well, this will strengthen America's position in Asia vis-a-vis China and others. There will be a wide range of issues. I don't think it'll be possible even to decide who is making that decision, because both groups will be supporting it, and it will be in the long run that we see whether it's really an economic objective, as I would hope it is, or a political objective, which is much more narrow in the U.S. But for the time being, it doesn't matter. Both of them will be pro-TPP. So I would think that moving forward will be possible, although I think I don't want to understate the complexity of the industrial issues of, the strength of the movie lobby or the strength of the biologics drug lobby. I mean, they will be very, very strong in arguing for their industries. The other question that was raised is on the Australian from the Australian position on is it the trilateral CJ China Japan Korea agreement or the ASEAN based RCEP concept that is likely to move forward. My guess is that at this point the RCEP concept is likely to be more viable than just the China-Japan-Korea agreement, because there is so much politics around that. While the ASEAN-based process is likely to involve less politics, it may be a convenient way for China, Japan, and Korea to cooperate without taking on the trilateral issues directly. And to be honest, that process is likely to offer a lot more flexibility, which then will make it possible for countries to avoid some of the hard compromises that might be necessary if they were to deal directly with each other. Now, the end result of that is partly good, partly regional integration, more regional integration, more movement on the Asian track, and partly not so good, which is that you will take a fairly low common denominator agreement with relatively, with ASEAN is not going to push for very high standards. China, Japan, and Korea will avoid adding very high standards of their own. So it's likely to be an agreement that is weak, but includes many countries. And I think that's in a way the beauty of the model that we are beginning to develop. On the one hand, you have a relatively small agreement which will have very high standards and very strong rules. On the other hand, these broader agreements which have lower standards, and we will need to compromise between them, and that will ultimately force standards to be higher, I think, throughout the whole region. If we can manage to keep these two processes from colliding, that is, if we can manage to keep these two processes complementing each other.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really the irony for this region, which is Northeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, geographically so close and historically and culturally so close, but three countries cannot sit by themselves, so they need ASEAN umbrella. And ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 3 makes up more than 90% of the economy, GDP, but still you need a 10% country to cover them. It's really a sad thing, really, to think of it. But politics, and I hope the region maturing up to grow out of this ironical situation in the near future. Well, I think we can go on like this whole morning, but I think we have to release Professor Petri. He has been engaged in various other lectures and speeches, and Koreans are taking full advantage of his visit here this time. So, again, appreciate very much for your coming to the lecture. Well, please join me in thanking the Professor Petri.